Divine.
there's a lot that's been on my mind. I hope you're doing well as well.
We are. We are. Well, I'd be curious, Mr. Seth. Seth is here.
Oh
He's
my
visiting us. The
goodness.
one and
Oh
here you
my
go,
goodness
Seth. Seth
gracious.
is here. The one and only Mr. Jogging. Look
Oh,
at that guy. Seth came down to
a
visit.
reunion.
I know it's
Oh, that's
beautiful.
lovely.
My
Man,
yeah, Seth.
I gotta get out. It's across the country for me, but I gotta make the journey at some point. You are blessed to be in the DC area, Seth, and just short drive away. Yeah.
Well, we are blessed to have him. We've
Well,
been having a lot of fun. The kids have attacked him already, so it's been perfect. So it's all going very well. But I'd be curious to hear what you're thinking about,
I think
Michael.
that's
What's
just
going
like
through
the
your head?
Gardener initiation,
Yeah,
right?
that's a Garner initiation. Yeah, exactly right.
Well, yeah. Um, well, I don't know if you saw, but Paul Vanderklay released a video a couple days ago. And it was on this video that the Free Press did, where they interviewed this woman who um she's an investigative journalist, and she's been researching this wellness cult. It's called One Taste, and it was founded in San Francisco. And I'll spare you the details, but basically, it's this sex cult. Yeah. And so um it's really fascinating stuff though. Like when you get into like kind of not just like the practices that they were doing, but kind of the like philosophy and how basically they branded like I mean like sexual exploitation as kind of wellness and something that is meditative and even spiritual. And um there was this, you know, this whole kind of marketing campaign, and I think they really capitalized on the it was founded in like the early 2000s, so it was kind of around when like a lot of Eastern spirituality was kind of migrating over to the West. And um but I mean there's all sorts of like I if if that is at if that is in any way interesting to you, I definitely encourage you to listen to the both the interview and Paul's video, because they touch on a lot of important stuff. But why he made a video about it was at the end, they kind of expanded from the cult to talking more about um, you know, kind of how to recognize if you're in one, and how to um, you know, like in chips. And the journalist talked about, even though it didn't sound like she was religious herself, she talked about the importance of religion and like you know, spiritual, not just necessarily institutional religion, but like having this connection to something beyond yourself. Because kind of one thing that this woman like really believed was essentially that there was no good or evil. Everything was just sensation. And so that was kind of part of her like business model of, you know, let's just like notice the sensations that arise. And even if we're doing like really perverse, like often like very predatory stuff, like, as you know, as long as you're paying attention to your body and all this stuff, like it's kind of all well and good. And kind of what Paul was saying and what this woman was saying was like, um, if you don't have, um, I mean, I'm still kind of fleshing it out, but like it kind of, you know, if you don't have this connection to something beyond yourself that's kind of guiding you, you kind of fall prey to a spirituality that is based on um, you know, like everything is good. Like she had this like thing called like aversion practices, where basically like if you aren't comfortable doing something sexually, like that's exactly what you should be doing. So there was like all this stuff where like people were being forced to do things that they were like really uncomfortable with. And there's like there's like a version of truth in that, like we talk about a lot, like, the absolute choice, like, stepping into experiences that push you beyond your limitations, so that you then have to rely on, faith instead of like rationality and logic, and experience of the beautiful, like being scary and being confrontational, like you talked about with Dante and Beatrice. um and so, one thing that like this journalist was talking about and I was reflecting on is like there's a razor thin line between um like philosophical truth and truth that, you know or distortion that is blanketed as truth in these cults, or else they wouldn't become popular if there wasn't some degree of like resonance, right? Like they wouldn't catch fire. um and so I've just been like, yeah, I've just been thinking about um how like I guess corruptible, uh philosophical, spiritual, religious ideas are, and how to ensure basically that that you don't find yourself in one, or you don't find yourself becoming one. I think something like the 12 step model, for instance. Like I listened to her do an interview with Dak Shepard, who's he has the podcast Armchair Expert. He's like a well-known actor and podcaster, and he's an AA, and he's like, I'd be the first to admit, like, AA checks a lot of boxes for cults. But importantly, there is no leader, right? Like there is no like charismatic figure that is, kind of wooing people in with seductive tactics only to, like change course. Like there's something about that democratic structure that allows um for freedom of exploration, for authenticity, for ability to challenge each other, right? And one last thing before I pass back, because I apologize for all this kind of scrambled thoughts, but there was something really profound that was said in the court, because now this woman's in jail, and there was a huge court case and everything, where like the one of the tactics the defense attorneys had is when they would interview these former members, um, they would ask them like, so when you were in this experience, like, was there a gun to your head? Like, could you have theoretically left? Because one thing that this woman did very cleverly is she didn't really like overtly make demands of people and lock them in cages or whatever. But she made them feel like they needed her validation, her continued approval. And someone said, like, if you can't freely say no, then you can't also really freely say yes. And so, people felt like even though the door was right there, that it was kind of this mind game that she would play of like if you actually walked out, like everyone would think you're you know you're weak, whatever, like you don't actually care about your own spiritual personal growth, like um and yeah, like I'm just comparing that. For example, like I just got out of Jacob Kashir's men's circle this morning, and this month the archetype is the spiritual gangster, and the idea which I love. And the idea is like in service of something greater than yourself, like in service of wholeness, of life, um, acting, counterculturally, like acting like, um, kind of not being afraid to cut against the grain, and have that kind of streak to you. Um, and man, that's very close to like, if that gets corrupted, like you can see how that can like there's like a shadow to that. So yeah, I've just been like, I don't know, I've just been meditating on um all of that. I think it's like a really fascinating listen, that video that Paul did, and the interview that she did. But you know, thinking about how a lot of these cults and things that can feel like cults are, they're like they're trying to respond in some way to, you know, the meaning crisis, to the crisis of belonging, to the crisis of um of faith. But you know, somewhere along the way the address gets corrupted. But yeah, I'll pass back.
Yep, that's getting at a lot. Good old sex cults. So good to see everyone today. Yeah, there's a lot of things with that as well. So, like everyone says, they want community, they want belonging, and all of that, and then you're at risk of cold exploitation and things like that, right? And then there's a reaction of just wanting to separate and be individual, and it just kind of swings back and forth, and so on and so forth, because there's a social technology here that is very, very difficult to think, right? I think also those dynamics, like one of those ways that you get psychological entrapment is because actually the line is blurred between free choice, choice you want to make, and so on, right? Like, and you could argue the logic of capital works this way because you don't have to work. You'll just be seen as a failure in your society and not very responsible and so on. So you're free and not free at the same time, right? Also, if you don't work, you won't be able to pay your bills. Or it's similar to sometimes can happen and be like, yeah, you can mention, you can talk about it, bring up whatever you want to the pastor, but you'll be kicked out of the church because that's heresy, right? Or with free speech. And I think also what happens there is Jonathan Routz, basically in a really good book called Kindly Inquisitors, would point out that we make a big mistake to think that the absence of, say, legal force or coercion, like no one's going to put you in jail if you do something, that's the same as freedom. That there's a difference between legal freedom and social freedom, right? Like, sure, there's no law that says you can't leave the sex cult or anything like that, but socially, you don't feel like you can, right? And so you actually end up kind of trapped, right? And so that distinction, like, what Rauch kind of talks about is we make a big mistake to conflate legal freedom and social freedom because they're not the same thing at all, right? But you see, there's also a major problem. And do let me know if the internet sucks. They supposedly have fixed the tree on the line, but if not, I can switch to this other thing. So I apologize. But social freedom and legal freedom are not necessarily the same. And actually, I think we actually don't really have a good sense at all collectively on how to maintain quote unquote social freedom, like what the benefits are of social freedom or anything like that. And that actually gets into the debate with liberalism we were talking about a few weeks ago, where I've just been comparing Russell Kirk, Friedrich Hayek, and Rothbard, and how they, kind of talking about how freedom does not guarantee wealth creation or a better outcome, that you need actually some sort of limit. Without limit, you become cancerous, to allude to Mr. Ebert's work. But then who sets the limit? And how do you have a limit, right? So the great Hitchens line, I really do appreciate. I think Christopher Hitchens was a remarkable. He had some lovely lines in Essayist, but he had that idea on it's not enough simply to have the freedom of speech. You also have to feel like you can speak freely, right? Like you have that kind of freedom. And like what's very interesting too is kind of what you see in these community dynamics is like with the sex cult. And it's also remarkable, and I think this gets to Cadell's work in psychoanalysis. It's actually remarkable how many communities turn into sex communities, right? Like that's just such a common thing, right? And basically, that's where if you don't face the libidinal, if you don't take seriously the libidinal, then it's going to come back and get you, right? You have to take that very, very seriously. I think one of the things that you see there, because there's a lot to because it's kind of it's like, well, no one intends to create a social or organizational structure that ends up this way, right? So how exactly would you, in the environment of the organization, put stuff in place to decrease the probability that you end up somewhere you don't want to go, right? Like, well, one of the keys is like adding a little bit of an inefficiency, right? Like adding limits, adding things that you hit where there's the possibility of the suboptimal, which again, I know Mr. Ebert has mentioned, right? Like if everything is so kind of smooth, where all you need to do is, oh, you feel something that you're afraid to do, therefore do it, right? it's actually the problem with that. It's almost too smooth, right? Because there's actually a meta move where you can say, I'm afraid to do this thing, therefore I should do it. But maybe I'm afraid to not do this thing that I'm afraid to do, because that will be the loss of spirit. Like there's a meta move that actually needs to be kind of encountered, right? And then also with that, are you really actually sure that you're afraid? Maybe you're being wise, actually. Maybe there's a wisdom in a sense that this is not the proper thing to do. But how do you tell the difference between fear and wisdom, right? How do you discern that difference? And you get into all of those different things. I think also, again, like a lot of the address that we talk about, you have to have all of the dimensions of it. Like it's not going to suffice to simply have one part of it, because if you have one part of it and not the others to be checking and balancing it, it could become corrosive or deeply problematic, right? Like if you have the hunger for belonging and you have people that are willing to be countercultural, but they don't have philosophy of self-defense, or they also can be assuming that basically, well, I think what you're describing is Philip Reef's Triumph of the Therapeutic, that basically overcoming a repression therefore leads to self-realization, and self-realization is necessarily good, right? Well, not necessarily. You know, that's where you would need the philosophical self-defense by which to identify those things, right? But I think a lot of what you're alluding to, and not to throw it at Seth, but Seth also had a wonderful time with the monks in DC. And we actually, it's really funny you bring this up, because we were basically talking about this. We were also talking about last week's language and things. So it's like you were sitting out there eating chili, and these dynamics between sort of the spiritual and the religion, and how you can say, well, we need religion, but then actually you're potentially creating dynamics for this sort of situation. But then if you also don't think these problems, well, like people join these groups because they're longing for something, dang it. Like they don't just, people join these things. Like they're vulnerable. There's something about the human condition that is going to seek their belonging. They're going to get it one way or the other. And if we don't think these problems, then it just ends up these perpetual cycles of people starting off with a religious enlightenment, starting off with something, and then it kind of spirals into something entirely else. So there's kind of a question on like what exactly are the mechanisms that you can put into a community that are imminent to the community, that basically no one top-down forces and yet are present in the texture of the organization to actually make everyone a little more skeptical of themselves, a little more, without necessarily moralizing, because you also can have an issue where if the only language people have is immorality, well, that may not work because the people in that organization may not necessarily agree with that moral picture, right? So there kind of has to be a texture to slow things down so that something doesn't get carried away that people don't control. I mean, a lot of that too, I guess, it does make me think actually about the AI race and how everyone's like, we can't stop it. It has to get the game theory, multipolar traps, and all those different things, and how those kind of logics seem very imminent to organizations. But I think, yeah, like I think also too, I guess the last thing I'll say, and then throw it to whoever wants to speak at all on this fine day, is that the moment you think you're basically over, or this organization is going to be different, or we're transcendent of those pathologies or dynamics, then you're setting yourself up, right? There always has to be reminding yourself that you're stupid, that you're ignorant, which I know Ebert has pointed out, like this realization that no, I'm dumb, and there has to be something to encounter limitation or different things. But I'll pass it on.
Say hello to everyone, live from Deer Haven. So it's great to be here. Thank you, Daniel, for the invitation and the warm welcome. And I've just been here for a couple hours and talking with Michelle and Daniel and all the kids out on the porch, warming up for the net. So that's great. And as Daniel mentioned, some of you may have been following this, or maybe some of you don't know, but there's this group of monks who just arrived in DC in the past couple of days, but they've been walking from Fort Worth, Texas for the last 15 weeks. So they have been walking across the country. It's called the Walk for Peace. And seems very much like the monk that decided to do this really just said, well, let's do it. And then people got wind of it. They have this dog walking with them. That's this cute dog who's like become the social media sensation. Anyway, the thing really as they say, has gone viral. And by the time I saw the monks yesterday at Lincoln Memorial, there were thousands of people there, and they had walked through DC, and they were doing a presentation at American University and George Washington University, and they spoke at the National Cathedral the day before. I mean, just their schedule in DC was incredibly packed. And, it says it all in the title, Walk for Peace. It couldn't be simpler. And yet people have been lining the roads, across the country. And like you see people just in tears when they walk by, or telling their life story to the monks when they come to town. And there was one monk, there was an incident along the walk where, because they're basically walking down the highway at some points, there was actually an accident where some car drove. I don't know, but what happened, unfortunately, the monk leg was broken, and so badly that he had to have it amputated. And so, he didn't continue, but I saw a photo of like all the monks standing next to him praying in the hospital, and like him saying, keep going. And then he was there in DC. They had brought him in, and he had this little like motorized tricycle that he was going along with. And then he spoke from the stage, and he just said, greetings to everyone, and sort of told the story. But he was saying, when I began, I had no idea there would be all these people. I just went on this walk because I am trying to, be a more loving person. And, when that accident happened, he tells how this other monk came over to him and put his hand on his head and asked him if it was all right. And he said, I thought I was going to die. And he says, in that moment, I was so glad that I practiced mindful meditation. That helped me when I thought I was going to die, right? And so it's like, whoa. And then the main leader gave a more lengthy talk, and he's just sort of telling people the importance of mindfulness. And he leads a very simple meditation where he asks people to take a few deep breaths, and then he says, put your hand on your heart. And I'm thinking he's really clever, because if you take a few deep breaths, it's going to be easier to feel your heartbeat. And then, he said, put your one hand on your heart, put your other hand on your heart. And he said, can you feel your heartbeat? And you have to imagine there's a lot of people at the Lincoln Memorial who've never meditated, who are following these instructions. So, just a few seconds, listen to your heartbeat. And then he says, can you imagine all your loved ones inside your heart? And then he sort of talks about, and then your neighbors. And then, so it's on the one hand, for anyone, who has a mindfulness practice, this all sounds familiar. And yet I'm just standing there looking at him saying, you just walked 2,300 miles to do this. You're standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and there's thousands of people listening to you. So the impact of the words, and I mean, I've been meditating for years, but I'm sitting there going, wow, oh, that's what it means to put your hand on your heart. So it was just like, there was something happening between the words he was saying and what he was embodying, and what I knew, like he had his credentials by having walked across the country, by having organized this thing. And of course, it was this major thing. There was like, of course, all these police that have to cordon off the roads, and like in town after town, this was happening. They were staying at universities and different churches along the way. So it was actually this massive thing that they put together. And then they would say things like, he said, another one of the things that he said, and again, I feel like I could hear another person say this in another context, and I could sort of say, yeah, that sounds nice, but I wouldn't fully take it in. But he says, it only takes about 5 seconds to hurt someone, or to hurt a whole family, or to destroy a community. And so I'm just asking you to practice mindfulness for 5 seconds. And then he had this sort of beautiful thing where he said the first second is loving kindness, the second is compassion, the third second means love, and the fourth was harmony, and the fifth was hope. And he kind of explicated each one of those things. But he would say things as simple as, love means that children grow up safely. And he would say these things, and the crowd would like go crazy. Like he said the word compassion, and people just started like clapping their hands. And I was like, dang, this is, and of course, no one missed that this is all happening while, we've had, the whole just craziness in Minnesota, and the Epstein files and everything, and I saw this interview with him on TV afterwards, and the broadcaster's saying, like, what was it like? And he said the first time that crowds of people came, I just was in tears. But then he said, there were people who came, and I've seen videos of this. There were people who approached them and said, you guys are with the devil, and what you're doing is wrong. Like there was, and he would just say, oh, we just don't pay attention to that. And it's so simple, but it's like, who's capable of not paying attention to someone screaming in their face that you're the devil? Like, but so just yeah, I'm attempting to transmit something that is hard to transmit, but it's like I felt like I received a transmission because this group of monks had just done this incredible thing. And it's like, you can say you're for peace, but then you can say, I'm gonna show it by walking across the country. I'm gonna, just phenomenal. So so I was listening to Michael. I was like, okay, so how do I connect this to the sex cult? but like the one phrase that came to mind was behavioral change, right? Like people, I don't doubt that a lot of Americans are checking out meditation for the first time after this thing that they've done over the past 15 weeks. I can't read the chat right now, but it also strikes me that with what you were sharing, Michael, it's like there's this way that if someone's really whatever sexually free, then they can be like, well, I'm freer than you are, so I can lead you. And like if I seem like this liberated and comfortable person and you admire me, basically the formula is you should do what I do. And so, and the only one who knows how to do what I do is me. So you need to listen to me. And, you can see where that goes in a dangerous direction right away. I mean, at the same time, what is the girdle point? It's always the place I've never been. So that is where we need to go in order to learn and to transform and do something new. But, again, I wasn't expecting the contrast between that story and the one that I had to share. But what I also was really struck by, and what we were talking about on the porch, is the fact that they touch so many people who don't think about meditation, who aren't into mindfulness. Or there's this one woman who said, I'm Christian, I believe in God, but I think God had something to do with getting these monks to walk across the country. And so, when he spoke about harmony, he said things that I feel like I've heard Daniel say about, he said, harmony isn't sameness. Harmony doesn't mean you agree. Harmony is about loving the person who's in front of you, no matter who they are. And he would say things like that. But I was just like, this is so clear. Like a lot of people, couldn't hang out on the net and understand what the conversation was about. But I feel like they were talking about so many of the things we talk about here in language that thousands of people were just nodding their heads and being like, yeah. So that was just another thing that struck me, is like, how do we take what we incubate in a community like this, which is so generative, and I know I take so much away, but then when I walk away from the net into a conversation with someone who would never come to the net, like how do I translate that? And gosh, I guess I have a lot to say here, but I'll just add one more thing. So Michelle and I were talking about this on the porch. I brought my table so we can do a little Feldenkrais practice while I'm here. But I was saying to Michelle, there was a point in time where when I was teaching Feldenkrais, or you could say the same, just you read a book and you're inspired. And there's this way that's like, well, I want everyone that I know to have the experience I had when I read this book. And so you start talking about the book, but then the other person's eyes are glazing over. It's like, oh, I think I had more attention on this image of the book inside my head, and I wasn't paying attention to the person I'm talking to. So how do we do that? And again, I just feel like I got this shining example of how it was done, because I know these monks could talk about all kinds of stuff, but it was so simple. They're all speaking English as a second language too, which was another thing that was impressive to me. Many of them are from Vietnam, but anyway, I'm just saying what's on my mind. We're just at the beginning, so I'll see how it connects to everything else.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Michael here and Dimitri and Jacob, because here it's good to spiritual gangster. So we are set. So, Mr. Seth has come down, so we're thrilled. So it's actually very interesting to think about. We have one point we're talking about sex cults, and actually it's very, very interesting to think of the difference between those monks and, say, the sex cult, right? And how when monks, after they walk thousands of miles, suddenly saying something, what we need is love. Why is it that that phrase you've heard 1,000 times suddenly has a deeper meaning, right? Why does it feel real with that, right? Which makes me think of last week when we're talking about what makes language language, what makes it work, right? Like it's just very interesting how you can't take the sentence, like if I were to say right now, well, what we need is more love, the experience of that sentence with the same information is very different than when the monks say it, right? But what if the person in the sex cult says, what we need is more love? And when you're holding back from sexual liberation and these practices, you're not open to love. And therefore, you know, you need to be willing and then you're taken advantage of, right? So, like, what is the difference between, like, one, there's a few things you could say, well, it's all just manipulation and people should just stop seeking any sort of guru or teacher or anything. That's very problematic. But then the problem is that gets into thing where, you know, that's getting into things like overcoming the big other or being able to deal with your desire. And that also gets to the idea that you need kind of a big other that dies, as Cadell says, that you kind of go through, because otherwise you end up pathological. But there's something about, like, what is the difference between the container? Because now you're thinking about the social, kind of the social phenomenon. What's the difference between people being in a container, that then lead to ending up in a sex manipulation versus the monks walking from Texas, right? Like, there's something about that where they're not really asking, you could say, for followers, maybe. Like, they don't have a container that then can get a life of its own, right? Because the meaning that they're bringing to their words is inseparable from the action. Whereas maybe there's a difference between that and the sex cult because the meaning comes from your inclusion, right? And the moment you have inclusion, you have the danger of various pathologies forming because now it's the in crowd, right? And then it gets into stuff Michael was saying where, well, you don't have to do this stuff, but then we're all going to see that you're a failure and not having self-realization and so on and so forth, right? Whereas the monks are like walking thousands of miles. Like, even if you wanted to do that, that would not be enough. Like, it would demand something of you, right? So that seems to have, there's a higher demand seemingly there. But I mean, someone could counter that and say, well, it's really hard to give in to peer pressure or to fight peer pressure. But there seems to be a difference in the kind of container going on. And also, too, perhaps the monks would be like, well, if you want to do this, you need to walk 2,000 miles, right? Like there's something also, I guess, comparing those differences and then thinking about, you could say ultimately, and like, I guess you could even talk about colleges or churches or different things. Like, it's interesting to think that what the monks do is in a way very simple. Like, it's actually not a secret. Like, you just walk from Fort Worth, Texas to DC. Like, you don't need hysteric teachings or like learning a difficult language. It's like, just do this thing, right? And do it in a manner where you don't give in to anger or different things like that, right? Where sometimes in these more sex cult dimension, there's a secret teaching that you have to enter to know, and no one else is willing to do it, and they've been repressed. There's no social repression that's keeping you from walking from Fort Worth, Texas to DC. There's not like a social pressure that says you can't do that. I mean, I guess you could say paying your bills and different things, and that would be fine. But theoretically, you could take at least a vacation week and walk 500 miles or something like that, right? So that seems to be a difference. So I'm quite taken by contrasting those differences. But I will pause and throw it to Michael here and then Dimitri. Michael, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is I really appreciate what you shared, Seth, because I feel like I just noticed it, it dropped me into just like a deeper state of awareness and appreciation, and it made me think too about how, in the journey that the monks are going on, like in some sense there's a practice involved with that. Like, the practice is mindful walking, mindful being, the expression of love, and all of this. But in another sense, like, just like what Daniel was saying, there isn't really anything more than just being. That's the prerequisite. And you can, if you're a member of the general public, like, you can join in for as long as you want and then leave. You can watch from, your phone or wherever you're seeing the clips. Like, there's an openness and there's an acceptance of, like in some sense, the telos, if you will, of of that experience is to just be. Like that's the orientation, is to just be. And um if you get, if you get approached by people who are crying, who are laughing, who are maybe triggered, whatever the range of human like reactions to that, to what the monks are doing, like their their orientation is to just be present with it all, right? Like there isn't a right or wrong um way of engaging with that practice of walking and of spreading, um that message. Whereas with the sex cult, like, I mean, oftentimes, like in this one, like there basically was just this collapse of any sense of good or evil. Like it was kind of just all like just it was just all good. Or it was just kind of all sensation, which kind of then flattens the actual experience of the actual sexual experience. Because if you're kind of just free to do whatever, then there isn't really like, and you're just kind of doing it with a bunch of different people, and it's like it's strangers, and like uh, yeah, it flattens, right? It flattens the sacredness of the sexual experience, because you're just having it all the time, and you're just having it with whoever. um and it's more about just stimulating arousal, and like cloaked in kind of this spiritual sense of being aware of your own sensations. um where, like, in some sense from the outside it might seem like, okay, all are welcome, right? Like this is the, and she would brand it as like, we're not gonna like be obsessed with like the end outcome of like the climax. Like we're gonna be like just aware of our body. And so, and she would call it like, yeah, anyways, I won't get into that. But like there was like Eastern meditation, like influence, like direct influence in like the naming and like some of the practices and stuff. So like there is this like similar thing going on, and I think the differences obviously in how they manifest between the two seem like such wide poles from each other. But I think in the initial like genesis of it, it's actually quite similar. But there is ultimately this um there's the social pressure, there's and I think that there's an implicit belief that if you join this organization, like you are somehow deficient in your, you know, sexual experience, and this is something you need, to get you to a certain place. Like a lot of the men that joined were like tech nerds in the Bay Area who like couldn't get girls, you know? Um, and so I think that there's this implicit belief of like this is the red pill, right? Like this is the thing to get you over this blockage in your system to, drop into your body and all this stuff. But then, as I say that, like that sounds kind of similar to like a lot of spiritual slash meditative practices. It's in their aim of like, getting our heady intellectual Western culture, into our body, into our experience. Um, and I don't know, maybe the main difference is the monks don't demonize that, right? Like they're not out here like um telling us how to be, or uh, like, or that we're not enough as we are, and we need, like, if only we could live more like them, then we would be, you know everything that's happening in the world wouldn't be the way it is. Like there isn't that spiritual superiority, moral superiority thing going on. I mean, I'm sure there's so much more, but I just think it's, and the last thing I'll pass it back, I just think it's interesting too, like basically the practices that they were engaged with were the exact same practices that were prescribed to treat hysteria, female hysteria patients in the 1800s. And then you fast forward to Freud's time, and Freud was treating a lot of hysteria patients. And, up until that point, hysteria was thought to be, I mean, it comes from like I think the Greek word that means uterus, like in ancient times and even like up until like modern times, it was believed to just be this disease that like was the result of like, female menstrual cycles and hormone imbalances, and was just kind of this like, kind of expression of female madness that like we don't really understand. And he was treating these women, and what he found was there was a chronic pattern of women who were victims of sexual assault as children. Like that was like a very common occurrence in his practice. And at first he kind of dropped the whole like, like Oedipal id thing, and he was treating like underneath the symptoms of like the root of the trauma. But then he realized that if this reality were to be, exposed to the medical establishment, it would have really like horrific ramifications, because what society would have to grapple with was sexual assault was rampant across socioeconomic status, across ethnic lines, across all this stuff. And so then he went back to essentially denying the woman's experience. And so like with this one woman in particular, he basically claimed that she actually desired the rape that her father that there was like something within her that compelled her to want that, and in its absence, that's why she's acting out in all these different ways. And that was almost exactly to a T what this woman so she was sexually assaulted as a child, and she got to a point where in her last like public news conference, she basically said that her father, who was this serial sexual assault person, was operating on like a fourth dimension that like people down in the third dimension like couldn't really understand. And basically she was saying like he's this enlightened individual, like just this like insanely psychotic stuff. And she apparently told like women on multiple occasions who were attracted to the organization because they had sexual trauma in their life, that like they desired it, and they like brought it on, and like just this like victim blaming on like a like a crazy scale. And so yeah, I was like, there is this like real like perversion of and in an attempt to restore agency, like that was like a big theme of her journey, was to like not feel like a victim and to feel like she had agency. And that was like part of her inspiration for creating the like practice, orgasmic meditation practice model that they had. And so again, it's like it's very similar to a lot of like spiritual practice and things like psychotherapy that like are agency expanding like arenas and practices, right? But the like, yeah, the line is super thin, and I'm still like kind of trying to parse that out, but it feels really germane to do that in the light of, I think, everything that's happening with Epstein and this like real kind of societal reckoning with um just the like the pervasiveness of this stuff, and yeah, how to really tarry with the like thematic, right? we've talked about that before, while not letting it go kind of ungrounded and untethered to something. But yeah, I've also seen the clips of the monk Seth and have been really taken by it, and really inspired by it. And yeah, it's amazing that you were able to, be that close to them and kind of feel that in-person presence. But yeah, I think that's kind of all for now. Pass it back.
Oh, it is very tricky. And as we see, wonderful to see you. We are talking about sex cults, and then we talked about monks and all these other fun things. I'll throw it to Dimitri, and if anyone else wants to speak. So there's a few things that come to mind. So it's very interesting. So we have the monks that are walking from Fort Worth, Texas, and there's some sort of sense of a self-realization, a certain sort of truth in that. Then there's an idea of these sort of sex practices releases. And it should be said, there is major confusion around sex. There are many repressed couples, like sex becomes a major issue. I mean, I think I will certainly say that Christianity doesn't really talk about it. John Paul warned in Theology of the Body, if you don't, it's going to be a crisis. People are confused about sex, and the fact that it seems like we either get sex cult or not talked about it. Couples are forced to think about it themselves, and then they don't even know how to talk about it with one another, and everything goes to heck, right? So it's a major problem. And there is some sort of truth in the idea that a failure to, quote unquote, release something about sex, the discourse or the thinking, has been extremely problematic and has led to various pathologies and so on and so forth, right? But then it seems as if it can end up in this interiority that's very problematic. So, and of course, the language of all of these is the monk seems to have a certain courage, right? There's a courage and a bravery to walk from Texas to DC. The language of the sex code is courage to go against the societal norms, courage to do these things you're uncomfortable with. I'm now thinking about that. Jacob Kishier had a wonderful video about, off the dome, stepping into the cipher. What's that sort of courage, right? The courage of getting on stage and being seen. Is that the same kind of courage? Is it a greater courage? Maybe it is, right? Because who's going to look at the monks walking from Fort Myer and sort of question the value of that, right? Or something. But if you get on a stage and you suck, then everyone's like, you're an idiot, right? Because the possibility of social negativity is higher, right? But then you do have the Christian telling the monks that you're, Satan, right? But what about the politician who's having to make a trade-off between decisions that are very, very difficult, say immigration and what's going on in Minnesota? The person who's actually writing that law, doesn't that take a certain courage? Because no matter what you say is going to be very problematic, right? And maybe the politician who's actually dealing with the real of the law when those trade-offs is actually the one who's putting themselves in the most demanding situation, right? Whereas, because that's going to require, like, no matter what you do, you have to face the real of trade-offs and the fact that there are irreconcilable differences between political parties. And maybe then we can talk about sexual release simply to avoid the real of politics, or talk about walking like the monks are in love and things to avoid the real of politics, right? But then it seems as if we continue to have politicians, because they're not getting something the monks have, that are ending up in the Epstein thing, right? Like, it seems like, and actually that seems to be very relevant, because the question is, why exactly does that operate? And then, of course, there's the question of what is the function and role of that around the world. The economist, the Black Lowy, actually had a very interesting take on that, to think of it in terms of incentives and coordination that we can get into. But there is this kind of idea of if we were to look at the sex, because all of these are also social dynamics as well, right? Like, they're inseparable from social dynamics. There's a notion that when the monks say what we need is love, a reason why that's so powerful is because there's also the context of Minnesota, the context of the breakdown of the global order, right? That adds a certain power to it. And the fact that they so much believed in this message that they were willing to walk from Texas, right? And perhaps the reason they were willing to do it is because of the things that are happening in the global order, right? That would compel the monks to do this, right? Well, likewise, people having various pathologies in sex and in their marriages or their families or being abused leads them to looking for these cults or for these organizations to kind of work through these things, right? So there's a social dimension in the background that is pushing things, right? And it is very interesting to ask, what is the character and quality of the subject that ends up doing these kind of things, whether it be, you know, how does the subject change who jumps on the stage to do the hip hop cipher, as Kashir has talked about, or the kind of subjectivity that is willing to step into the political arena to have to make decisions or write laws between competing goods or competing issues, inclusion, exclusion, immigration, enforcement, all these different things, and the subjectivity that is also looking for subjective release. There is a truth of the social condition in all these, and I think also a key character, perhaps to kind of start pointing at, and I'll throw it to Dimitri and anyone else who wants to speak, perhaps a key characteristic of a social dynamic and of a social dimension that tends to go in a pathological dimension is this move where the problems of the organization are the individual's fault. Like, you know, if you're feeling uncomfortable in the sex cult, it's because you're not enlightened. It's your problem, right? Like the same can happen in the church. If you're uncomfortable with the message the church is doing or how the pastor is approaching you, and obviously the churches have had sexual problems, right? Well, it's your fault, right? Or you're being judgmental, right? You could say one of the things that keeps the economy from reforming is because if you're not able to buy a house or succeed, it's your fault. You didn't work hard enough, right? It's your fault that occurred. And perhaps that social dimension is part of it. And maybe what's different about the monks is that the monks is not making something your fault, right? It's not making something your fault, right? There's more of a kind of performance art, like a certain sort of expression that is to point to a possibility that can actually be lived and that could actually change the quality of social interactions if it was actually participated in. But then the question is, to what degree can that translate into the political real of writing laws or making decisions where it just seems like no matter what you do, it's going to be disastrous, right? To what degree is that central to the political question or ignoring the political question? But then if you don't have the kinds of subjects who seem to be able to do what the monks are talking about or doing, then if they enter into the political, they might just end up in the upstate, right? So it's interesting to think how these things overlap and interrelate, but I will throw it to Dimitri here and anyone else who wants to speak. Dimitri, good to see you today, sir.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Good to see you guys too. What a topic, sex cults. Yeah, I remember when I was in a sex cult, so it's a topic that's really dear to my heart. If you think I'm joking, I'm really not. There's a paper I wrote about my experience in this sex cult, where I apply German idealism and psychoanalysis to try to understand my experience and what sex is and what metaphysics are. And by the way, Daniel, you're implicated in this because you edited the goddamn book in which this paper is. So yeah, I mean, I also did some stuff on my YouTube channel about it, but I deleted it all because it doesn't have to be there. So, but yeah, the paper is there, and I'm really, it feels ambiguous because I would never go to a sex cult now, but yeah, I mean, it's part of my history. Like literally the first major writing that I did is on a sex cult. So I do have some things that I can say about this. Yeah, so why did I go? Maybe that's a good one to start with. Why did I go there? Did I go there to have orgies and stuff? I guess that was part of it. But I thought about it in a different way. So there's this guy, he's called Alexander Bart, and he said that if you want to do spiritual practice, you have to start with your sex life. Because if you do go in another way, you can use spirituality to not solve the sexual problems that you have. And so I heard this and I thought, damn, that's just right, because my sex life is a fucking mess and I'll probably have to start with it. I was 22 back then. And so I got to know about Tantra, and especially this particular sex cult called the New Tantra. You can also look them up. And yeah, they said, and Alexander Bart was talking about this, and multiple people were talking about this, that the goal of Tantra and tantric sexuality and tantric sexual practice is really not sex. It's enlightenment, and they have their own kind of theology with it. And then there's Osho, who has his own kind of thinking about how this goes. And so I mentioned these guys in the paper that I wrote. And yeah, so I was reading mainly Hegel and Alenka Zupancic, and so there's a quote by Alenka Zupancic that I really like. It's very simple. She says, "The key to sex is in speech." Also very psychoanalytical. The key to sex is in speech. So the key to sex is not in the act. It's not in what you do. It's not in maybe what you feel or don't feel, but it's in what you can say about it, or maybe what you can't say about it. But it's about speech. So I thought I had this quote in my mind when I went to the sex cult, and every day in the morning we would have these reflection sessions about what happened the day before, and I would always use that moment and take it super seriously to try to speak about what happened and what I enjoyed, or what I didn't enjoy, or whatever. Yeah, whatever. This was years ago. I don't really remember a lot of what I said, but I spoke about what happened. Like, and yeah, I mean, the craziest stuff happened. It was like normal people would classify it as just constant orgies. That's how normal people would classify it. But no, there was a real like build up to it. So it was not like trying to speak us into courage to get to have sex, but like everyone was really continuously working with overcoming each other's resistances, and yeah, also saying, we're getting rid of our shame and our guilt and our insecurity, and we are going to get that pure sexual experience. And it didn't flatten it at all. Like I learned how to have great sex at the sex cult. Like all the techniques I learned, it's very cold actually. There is something very cold about it, but it's not flat. Like it's cold in the sense that there's it's a technical thing. But anyway, so yeah, you get eased into it, you overcome your resistances. There's a spiritual story about it, but people really look at each other and they take care of each other very seriously, because it's important also for the group. So yeah, there's another thing that really inspired me when I did this. So and that's a quote by Hegel. So Hegel says, "The force of spirit is only as great as its expression, and its depth goes only as deep as it trusts itself to disperse itself and to lose itself in its explication of itself." Beautifully Hegelian. The basic point that he's trying to get across is that you gotta go and express yourself and lose yourself in your own expression and go as deep as you can and trust yourself. And yeah, like you have to play it out. You have to go for it. Like go for your desire. That's kind of the imperative here. And I thought it was so beautiful. So that's how I went into it. With Supancic and Hegel, philosophy and psychoanalysis. And I mean, yeah, I definitely did get rid of a lot of, like my sex life was never the same anymore. I kind of became a different person because of it. And like in a great way, but I went way too far. So that was really the problem. Like afterwards, I was like doing sexual stuff with different people all the time, and then like if I did things that I regretted, like I wouldn't have done it. But now, I mean, after that I had a period that I went celibate. I was like, I just have to not do anything with it. Yeah. So but yeah, then I had a relationship and we had a breakup, so that's been crazy. But no, it's not that I really want to talk about myself actually. But I think the thing with sexuality is it's like you can't express anything about sexuality in a neutral way. Like it's always personal. It's always about not just you saying something about sexuality, but you're also like, why are you saying this about sexuality in this way? You're like naked there. And at this tantric retreat that I was at, it was like, damn, you're so naked. Like you're literally naked and you can't lie. So yeah, it's like I think the most important thing that I learned there, I tried, is like basically also the negative experiences. And I mean, it was super blissful. Like it was super blissful all the time. We just had an amazing time. Like there's things your body can feel that are so incredible. But yeah, there's like also like stuff like jealousy, right? Like this kind of stuff, like multiple people there, and then yeah, things happen. So I got to know my jealousy very well. and I also got rid of it because I faced it so stubbornly and adamantly. And that's really because I also went with it with a kind of philosophical mind. So yeah, like it's not that. And I eventually also saw like, why are you guys still living like this? Like, isn't tantra about getting beyond sex in a way, like about not needing it anymore? But why do you keep having those orgies? Why do you keep having threesomes or whatever sums? And so I would never return to that life. And I actually think I'm doing way more interesting things that I did, but I'm glad that I did it, and that it's and that it will always be part of my history, and that you guys can all get the book for like whatever $26 on Amazon right now, edited by yours truly and Daniel Garner. Yeah.
It's on Amazon, everyone. But no, thank you for sharing all that. And if anyone else has anything to say today, there is no doubt that the failure to discuss sex because people don't know how to do it, or you're nervous or whatever, leads to all sorts of problems, right? It leads to all sorts of confusions. People, sex is dirty, sex is bad. People don't know what to think. They repress, and then they get married, and then they have to kind of work through all of that. And it's not good because they don't know where to start or what to think about it, right? I think also what you were saying, like, the interesting wordplay between intercourse, between sex and speech, this cannot be overstated, right? Is that, sexuality is reflected in speech profoundly, right? And that actually makes me think of the interesting kind of last week we were speaking, where Eva was pointed with the semantic and the mantic, the sort of idea that what does it mean to talk about semantic sex and also this sort of perhaps mantic sex? Like, what is the experience that's kind of, does sex kind of navigate between those two things in different ways? I'm not sure. But there's no doubt that also, like, we see that the inability of people to take sexuality seriously, it's going to show up. And I think also it's just interesting what you were saying, because and also what Michael was saying on the idea that, it's not about the sex, or there can be that emphasis, it's about coming through the sex perhaps. Well, you would have churches say that this isn't about politics, this isn't about power, this isn't about this life or anything like that. Well, that kind of disavowal would usually be very problematic. There would be power hierarchies in the church. There would be interest in money and power and stuff like that. Similarly, if you have political leaders that say it's about the country, it's not about me, it's not about my career, it's about the country. Well, no, you can't make that separation. One is always participating in those things. And the moment you kind of push it away, it becomes very problematic. I think also what ends up happening is if sex isn't taken seriously, like you're saying, then you never have to confront your jealousy. You never have to confront your envy. You never have to confront those parts of you that are possessive, right? But how do you tell the difference between possession and care, right? Like, maybe you don't want your partner to get involved in things that will hurt them. You don't want people to get caught up in things that turn into a sex cult, right? So maybe a little bit of that jealousy and possession would actually be a good thing or something, right? How do you tell the difference? How do you tell the difference between those things, right? Well, that seems to suggest you would need philosophical discernment to some degree to work through those things. But how are you sure that you're not just kind of trapped in your own head, defining things in ways that are beneficial to you versus not? And then you end up vulnerable, right? Well, this seems to suggest, again, that the social setting itself has to have something in the texture that is a check and balance on self-deception. Because I think also, to a lot of these different code examples that are described, like, there's another thing a lot of it, like, a cult wouldn't be a problem if it was all bad, usually, right? Like, it has to have some benefits to the people. It has to have some sort of feeling of insight or awakening for people to stay. The question of, when does it go too far? Like, when does it extend too far? How can you tell, right? Who says, right? And maybe what's too far for one person is not for another. Oh, Aspasia, please.
So what you're talking about there with the jealousy is really interesting, right? Like, the whole kind of jealousy, working through jealousy and working through envy by, through a sex cult. I think, and I guess this is what you were just saying, I think there's a discernment to be made about, is the sexual impulse towards this person that I'm feeling related to, a transference of my attachment figure, essentially? Like, is the charge that's here really more about unresolved issues with my, primary attachment figure? And if it is, then having, like, actually acting out sex with that person, from everything I've seen in all my work, is a destructive move. But it comes with a whole range of, very exciting feelings, and people need to get clearer on figuring out, I think, when they are transferring the image of their unresolved attachment trauma onto someone, and to understand how to get underneath that to really see the person as much as you can, as opposed to seeing the template that you are placing over the top of them. That trying to figure out how to turn that into some sort of plain language that makes sense to people is very, very difficult for me. I think because I work with it so much in session now, it just makes intuitive sense, and I see it over and over again how it plays out. It feels like a repair, like you get tricked into thinking this is some kind of deep repair to your system, like you get the thing that you were always longing for, but there's an inherent taboo to the sexual impulses towards the parent, which, I mean, the more I think about it, sort of functions as this limit where there needs to be some kinds of limits. So when I think about things like sex cults, I can understand when I listen to the way that people talk about it, I can understand the trick of how it sounds like this is a really liberating, repairing. I mean, my mind goes back to like sublation. Like they think it's this this act which is going to somehow elevate them into some other. But in my mind, it's not. You're actually you're doing the opposite, and it's finding a different way. It's finding a different possibility within that relationship. That is the key. But I have to go because I do have clients. But I've loved this. I feel sorry for my first client because now now my mind's just on sex. But it was lovely to see you all.
Well, very good to see you, Asper.
And lovely to
Thank
see you
for jumping
together,
in.
you two as well.
Yeah, we're having a good time. Yeah, we already had chili on the porch, so it's been great. I'm sure the kids are listening in. This is great. They're probably
this is a great
right
one.
there. We're having a good time. So it all works out. You're a gentleman, Alex. I'll throw it right to Alex here. But no, what you were saying there, I think, is actually very important. I do think people are doing that sort of thing. But let me throw it to Alex Ebert here. Mr. Ebert, thank you for coming today, sir.
Hey guys, I'm a bit sick, but
Oh, I'm sorry. That sucks.
There's an ongoing there's an ongoing debate between me and my wife and all of her friends, and I'll tell this brief story. In the first 3 months, she was like, all right, let's put a party together. I want you to meet all my friends. I was like, great. I get wasted. I have my buddy come over and we get into a massive fucking fight where all of these skeletons come out. I'm going bonkers, and to the point where his wife says, like, we have to leave, and she takes him away. And then Rian is her name. My wife thinks it would be a great for me to bring up the argument that I've been having with all her actor friends. So now there's about 7 women, and me, and one actor friend of hers. That's a man named James. He's sitting next to me, and then it's the 7 women, and then one other actress to my left. She'll come into the story very heavily at the end. And I say, this is my premise. It's very simple. Frequency of interaction increases the likelihood of an effect of that interaction becoming sexual. Likewise, pretending during the frequency that you are in love with another person, pretending that you are anything, increases the likelihood that you may become something of that thing that you are pretending to be. If that is reciprocated and both people are pretending to be in love with each other for a sustained period of time, that will likely increase the probability that those 2 people may feel something outside of the make-believe, outside of the constraints of the make-believe. Very simple premise. Denied by all of them. All of them denied unequivocally that no way did acting precipitate in any sense feelings beyond the role that they were playing sexually. Now, meanwhile, I have, and so my backstory is my mother left her husband for my father in acting class when they were pretending to be together. Then she left my father for another man who she was also with in acting, doing a play with, where they were pretending to be together. My dad cheated on my mother with a woman who was his client, who he was helping to come, because she couldn't get an orgasm. All of these role-playing things precipitated these behaviors. So, of course, I grew up with this, right? Now, I'm not claiming anything else at this party other than pretending to be in love with someone and may increase the likelihood of you, especially day in, day out, the likelihood of you feeling something for that person outside the scope of your work, denied by all. So then I started asking questions, and it wasn't just denial and then let's move on, vehement denial. And it became this massive row. Now, the guy sitting next to me, James, she's a friend of Rian's. They wanted to audition for the Actors Studio, where my mom actually teaches, and he suggests a play. He suggests a play, and she says, James suggested this play, we do this scene together. Now, it's a play about two very good friends, which James and Rian are, who finally, at this breaking point, their emotions pour over, and they finally say that they love each other, and they embrace in a kiss. Now, I've always suspected that James is in love with Rian in real life, right? And he suggests a play that is a literal LARP on their relationship. James denies this, and of course I have to bring this up at the party now, right? Everything is falling apart for me. Everyone's yelling at me. I apparently don't know what I'm talking about. And then quietly, the woman next to me, Selena, who is Rian's best friend, who's been silent the entire night, says, I actually have some recent experience with this. My husband, Rossif, my husband of 10 years, just left me for his co-star. And she is a kid and all this stuff. And it had just happened. It was super fresh for her. And of course, it was his co-star that he was pretending to be in love with. And so now I bring all this up simply to say it reminds me so much of civilization and its discontents. The basic Freudian supposition that civilization is built on the repression of sexual impulse, and that without it, we do not have the scaffolding for society. Certainly, actors apparently do not have the scaffolding to be actors without the denial of the idea that pretending to, that pretend doesn't leak into their life. Meanwhile, I have friends, but also just great examples all over the place of I also acted. So just as a kid, I messed around, and absolutely. By the way, any of us who've ever been to the cinema, saw a gangster movie and come out of the cinema yeah, motherfucker, you think your art, life imitates art. And then if you're inside the art, life definitely imitates the art. So anyway, there's an interesting relationship between the denial of sex and the ability to erect scaffolding along the lines of culture, work, the workplace environment, and then society and culture at large. So anyway, I just wanted to share that story. I don't know if, for instance, porn stars are more or less likely because they consummate the act and the denial isn't there, if they're more or less likely to cohabitate or to continue a sexual relationship beyond the filming. But from a brief search I did while waiting to speak, it looks like they do. So that's kind of interesting. Not sure how that flies. Also, obviously, we'd be curious with someone like Dimitri, who's been intentionally in a sex cult or whatever it is, the extent to which emotion and the sensation of connectivity felt circumscribed just to the activities of the day, or the extent to which suppression of those emotions and those feelings was required to even have the cult in the first place, by the way. Because if we're going to have a cult, one of the presuppositions is going to be, well, yes, sure, we'll have sex, but that doesn't mean anything. And a lot of these sort of like open free love things, again, they're trading in one denial for another. So you get to have all access to total sex, but in exchange, you deny the emotional, and you call it NEP, like, oh, that's just new relationship, NRE, that's just new relationship energy. You dismiss that. For everyone else, that's called falling in love. But for them, that's NRE. Like, you're a fool if you fall for NRE. So I think that denial has a very like powerful function in terms of organization, social structure, and one way or the other, social structures are dependent on one form of sexual denial or the other, either sexual denial or emotional attachment denial. So it's interesting. Anyway.
First, that story's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Second, I think the dynamic you're describing about the pretending leading, I think that's getting at a lot. And actually, I think is very important because I've had that experience where actors like, no, it's just pretend, and they act. And I think it's really interesting what you're saying, that the pretending, the denial is the prerequisite for the scaffold for doing the thing. Like if they didn't deny it, if they truly believed that they become what they pretend to be, well, then no one would do it because you wouldn't. You like every role you receive, you'd be like, well, do I want to become that thing or whatever, right? You couldn't do the job, right? And what I'm finding very interesting too, because in the example of the sex cult Michael made, and that Paul was talking about, there's absolutely this idea. No, this ain't sex. This is science. This is science. You know, this is research backed. It has nothing to do with sex. And I'm wondering as well, because I will definitely say this has been the thing that leads to the most, in my experience, the most problematic dynamics in church settings is this kind of pretending like it's not that. No, it's not that actually, where the pastor's like, no, it's not about power and self. I'm not, it's not about that, right? Well, that's when they get this kind of ego and self-grandeur, right? These sex culture, it's like, well, it's not about the sex, it's about personal enlightenment. Well, that's where it becomes very problematic. And perhaps a dynamic, because we've sort of been exploring these different social dynamics that give you different outcomes. Perhaps one of the most dangerous social dynamics, and then I'll give it to Michael, and if anyone else has anything else to say. Oh, and Christian, thank you for coming, sir. Is the denial that what you pretend to be is what you become. Like the denial of that seems to be at the heart of where you get into a lot of trouble, right? Like where you have the leader of the sex group who's basically saying and pretending like doing these sexual activities will not lead to sexual engagement. You know, it will just be science. It will just stay in the personal release. Well, that's when you get the trouble, right? When you get the pastor that acts like having this position of power is not going to lead to political and problematic dynamics in the church, that's when you get trouble, right? I think that starts to perhaps be something that adds that texture, that ruffle in the internals of the interaction that help you from getting pulled along somewhere where you don't know how you got there, right? Because that denial, that pretending doesn't lead to the thing, that creates this sort of smoothness where you don't have this self-skepticism. You just kind of go along and then, yeah, you end up falling in love, right? And I'm not necessarily moralizing or anything. I'm just saying that this mechanism that occurs in organization where it's like, how did this beautiful thing that we started 5 years ago end up in this horrific thing where everyone was hurt, right? How did it, like, you hear that all the time. How did this small group, how did this organization we started that was supposed to be different from the rest of the world end up in this place where nobody wanted it to go? And then I'll throw it to Michael and Christian here. Well, it seems to be part of this idea that you're above the activity that you're participating in, that the activity that you're participating in doesn't actually then have an impact on who you are. And if you're pretending to fall in love, then yeah, you actually do fall in love. If you pretend to be, if you're acting like the head of an organization that kind of in your positioning seems better than other people, then you come to think that way and you think you should have power over people, right? It does impact you. And if you deny that, then you end up getting carried along. So accepting that seems to be really important. So I really appreciate what you shared there, Alex. I'll throw it to Michael here and then Christian. And if anyone has final things, I think we are going to take a walk down to the creek with the children because last time Seth was here, that was a promise. That was on the agenda. So we're going to make that happen. But let me throw it to Michael here. Michael.
But I was just thinking on Alex's story and yeah, that, I mean, I've observed that phenomenon too. And it's interesting because I think one potential response to, say you're an actor in that situation and are playing a part where you're in love with someone, and say you're, already committed to someone else, like one possible response coming out of that would be to tell your co-star, like, okay, that was just acting, right? Like we were just playing a part. We weren't like, that wasn't real. In some sense, that was like just, a fiction, right? But that doesn't feel totally like true, because to play the part convincingly, like you do have to, I mean, you have to act as if you are really in love with that person. And maybe there are real feelings there, right? Like maybe there are real there is like a real spark and connection. And maybe if you were really honest with yourself, it might be one that, in either depth or degree or uniqueness, like isn't one that you share with your current partner. But I think one of the reasons, like, I'm interested in the topic of marriage, and I'm going to speak with Daniel and Michelle on that, God willing, next month, is it seems like that is one, in the till death do us part thing of that, like it creates it creates like a commitment that is like higher and stronger than just one's feelings, right? Because you can come out of you know acting like you're in love with someone and have these really strong feelings. And I think in like the sex cult thing, it's like, oh, just let your feelings, guide you, right? Like if you really feel attracted to this person, just go and have sex with them, because like the feelings is like the like the guiding, you know, ontology or something. Um, and that just obviously has like disastrous implications. Like if feelings, and I hear like Christians talk about this all the time, of like how um like being guided by your feelings is like that's not like the Christian walk. Like it's to be guided by God, and sometimes that means doing things against what you feel. You feel like you might want isolation and to be by yourself, but like what you're really being called to is for community, right? Just as an example. And it's obviously not to say like if you are constantly being made to feel bad about yourself, with someone else, that like you should just stay in that relationship or whatever. But yeah, there's just like a curiosity in me around like it's clear that there like need to be, like, we need to think about the topic of relationships and sex as a part of that, more deeply than just, if I feel all the feels with this person, that means I should be with them. It's like, well, like if that means like the end of a marriage that you built for X amount of years, that um has like taken a lot of sacrifice and like has a lot of beauty in it, and as a result of time maybe doesn't have the like the like dopaminergic like endorphin rush every time, but it's a deeper love. Dang it, like it's like there's something, I don't know. um and I feel the move to say, oh, it's not about sex, it's about enlightenment, or insert whatever a cult focus is about. um that obviously leads, like, can be very problematic, because it can lead to spiritual bypassing like very easily, because it's like, well, if it's if it's just about enlightenment, then like we can kind of justify, you know, all these different acts because like they're orienting you towards the ultimate bliss. Like, don't pay attention if you're feeling uncomfortable or feeling exploited or whatever. Like, you're ultimately on a path to, you know, to enlightenment, and like just push through it, whatever. But yeah, I think the Alex's story, I think, is something, yeah, that's like really, I mean, it's kind of hilarious in one way. It's like there's all these examples of how those relationships come to be through, you know, the acting as if you're in love, and yet, you know, people kind of still can't see it. And yeah, but I think that there's something around like thinking relationships beyond just feelings. Not to discount them, absolutely. Like it's, you know, I think there's more people who are probably not tuned in at all to their feelings than people who use it as a way to justify, you know, every action that they do. Um, so, you know, I think like therapeutic practice, that's usually the first step, is to like actually get in touch with how is this really landing for me? How am I actually feeling? But you know, to make every decision just based on, oh, I just had this amazing magical 1 month with this person, and so I'm going to leave my partner of, you know, 10 plus years, because, you know, society tells me to just follow the field. It seems also problematic. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, I think that's wonderful. I'll give it to Christian if anyone has final things. I'm very interested as you were speaking and just what is so this idea that a role makes real. So the role of roles and real making that follows, right? Because there's also, like you say, there's a danger in being like the emotions, following the emotions and giving them the final say. On the flip side, there can be a denial of the reality of emotions, right? That emotions are meaningful to people, and that if you tell people their emotions don't matter and they should kind of get over them and just stick to the commitment, well, that might remove the incentive of people in their marriages to make them well flourish just because they're bound legally, right? So there's also a danger in treating emotions if they don't have a role, but it becomes very, you know, it has to be considered on all the different sides of it. But the thing that's interesting, so to me, as we're speaking here, because I think what Mr. Ebert has pointed at is this idea that, because it's pretending, like pretending makes real. Like you can't pretend to do something without it then gaining reality in the doing of it, right? So there's a way in which the language I want to hear is roles. Like if you have a role, you can't do a role without in some sense becoming the role. So there's something about roles in real making. And the reason why I bring this up is because I'm now thinking about the role of roles in, let's say, the cult, the monk, the politician, and the performer. Because, you know, we mentioned those four. So we mentioned about the monk walking to DC. We've mentioned the hip hop artist with Mr. Casero, the artist in general who's performing, the politician who is making hard legal decisions, blah, 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 the real, and the cult leader. What is the role of roles in each one of those four? Because it seems like there's a different role of roles in each of those fours. And perhaps one of the reasons so many groups become pathological and fall apart is because they're not taking seriously the role of roles, right? So when I look at like the cult example that you made, there's a denial that this role that, and you know, sex is having will not actually translate into sexuality, sexual desire. Really, there's this idea that we can, in a very real sense, keep sex and desire apart, right? Via technique, right? So you're kind of denying the role of sex on human beings, which is to cultivate desire. That is what sex does. It is tied to desire. You can't really separate those things. And if you act, and you're like, well, if I act like I do, I can keep those apart. Well, no, your internal desire of how to relate to sex cannot eclipse the role that the physical activities themselves have on the formation of the subject in the human being, right? So there's a certain denial of the role of the role. It's interesting with the monk, because the monk's not really pretending, and it's obvious because they're like, you can't fake walking from Texas to DC, right? Like there's no faking in that, right? And even if theoretically, let's say everything the monk believes is false, let's just say it's all pretend, it doesn't really make sense to say it's all pretend because they're doing it, right? So there's a way in which maybe the monk accepts the role as the reality. They say, I'm going to take on the role and become that role. So there's not really a denial of the real making, right? There's kind of more of an acceptance. And this is all tentative, but I'm thinking of the role of roles between these four, because I think the role of roles is perhaps not thought enough in social organizations. And that's why we keep getting these pathologies in different forms, right? So the role, the performer, the hip hop artist who jumps onto the stage, they're throwing themselves into the role and they're really scared and they're really afraid. But it's the idea that, well, if I jump on the stage and force myself to do it, I'll actually gain courage, which is very interesting because then in that sense, it's like an owning of the fact that if I jump into a role, it will actually change me, right? If I jump onto the stage and do something brave, you're actually saying that will actually make me brave, right? So there's almost an acceptance of the real making of roles. And perhaps that's part of imposter syndrome, or the guy who gains courage by they're scared, but they say, well, if I act like I'm not scared by fighting this thing I'm afraid of, that will actually make me courageous. But that's very interesting because it's kind of like you're pretending to make it real, right? So it's the role of roles there is to accept that roles change you and entering into it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what does the politician do? Well, often it almost seems as if the politician, precisely because, I mean, this is a way I think about it, because I was, in my, I suppose every now and then I'll watch congressional meetings because I hear you're supposed to do that to be civically informed. But what's very interesting is I always feel like the politicians are playing a role to protect themselves from the unbearable decisions and trade-offs that actually have to be made in the federal government. Right? Like you almost have to play a role. Like why is there so much like partisanship, for example? Because I think partisanship is not examined enough as having a psychological function for the governmental officials themselves to deal with the decisions and positions they're in. Because you basically say, I'm Republican, so I vote this way, right? Like you play a role to basically disavow the feeling of the trade-offs and the weights of the decision you're making. Because let's say you make a decision to support ICE and everything happens in Minnesota, you can always say, well, it's my party. Like, and you kind of play a role almost to protect yourself from the psychological tension, right? So it's using the role as a shield. But then the issue is, since you can't pretend to without forming, you as a politician actually hurt your subjectivity. Like when you meet like I don't know if you've had this experience, and I'm not saying I'm any expert. When you meet politicians who have been in office for a long time, they are their role. Like they for so long have gotten in the habit of doing that's just what they do. It actually becomes their own thoughts. Now, I don't want to say every politician, blah, 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 but there really is this kind of idea that, yeah, you become the role. Like the politician loses, they lose nuanced ideas. They lose all of the complexity precisely to psychologically deal with the weight. And I'm not saying always, sometimes, they're actually much smarter than you think. It's just, group incentives and the Congress or whatever. But there's a certain sort of like taking on the role of the member of the party precisely to deal with the weight of the decisions you're making. So you don't feel so guilty about them or they're too unbearable or something like that, right? So, and then I'll give it to Christian if anyone has more to say. I'll have to think further, but, from this conversation, I'm more now just thinking of is perhaps many organizational problems a result of a denial of the role of roles. And perhaps one of the reasons the monks stand out is because of this sense of you can't fake that like even if you think, because it's also kind of interesting, no doubt, like there are many people who see the monks and say they haven't, this is just kind of kumbaya, this will never translate into policy, it's not going to do anything. And yet nevertheless there's a feeling of even if in a sense this is pretend, even if in a sense it's pretending that this would make a deal when it would not, big deal when it would not, they're living the role. They're not denying it because they're doing this walk. And so there's a power in it regardless, right? So I will have to think more, and I'll give it to you. I'll have to think more on the role of roles, but that might start to be gesturing toward the opening questions on how organizations end up like they do. But let me throw it to Christian here. Christian, good to see you, sir.
Did you say like your kids are around, Daniel? Are they in earshot?
Oh, no doubt they are. No. They can't. No. You're good. You're a
Okay,
gentleman,
okay,
Seth.
good. 'Cause
We'd be
it's just
we'd
us
be in,
boys.
we'd be in trouble after today's sex cultal. That
Yeah.
would be
Speaking
hilarious.
of sex cults, um, so I used to be a part of this meditation group, and it's called Finder's Course. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. It's this pretty, I actually think it's an amazing meditation program. Um, but the guy who put it together has always struck me as kind of shisty. And he struck a lot of people that way. But first of all, I'll just pitch this idea because I think it's so brilliant. He just kind of like figured out what the gold standard meditation practices are that, according to his research, most reliably and quickly kind of transition people to pseudo enlightened or very enlightened states. And then he just the key insight that he found in his research that I agree with and think is really smart is the idea of fit. Oh, wow. Huge, right? Yeah, there's going to be certain people who are going to respond better to certain meditation practices. And I think he said he figured that out when he would talk to someone who's like, they're doing Zazen for a decade and then they try mantra for 2 weeks and boom, instantly they have this powerful experience. And so, oh, wow, yeah. So he just, in the course, he just runs everybody through all like 12 different meditation practices, stacks them on top of each other. Anyways, it was really powerful for me, powerful for others. So like a little community formed of people who have gone through that course of like alumni. And I'd say like half of them were all like, yeah, that guy Jeffrey's kind of weird though, right? Anyways, he was in the Epstein files from Deepak Chopra, who like recommended him to Epstein, who's like really interested in like energy transmissions and stuff. And by far the weirdest thing I've read in the Epstein files so far, where Jeffrey Martin, the guy who created the meditation course, that's all it is. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was what you brought up, and this ties in, Michael, is like this whole thing of us like trying to interpret our feelings and what's a feeling, what's like an honest feeling, because this is something that, speaking of cults, like I always really dislike. I'm very allergic to this kind of like this appealing to this kind of transcendent feeling, and you have to listen to your feelings, and you can't be imprisoned by the rational mind. You have to, right? And there's like a lot of like affective things you can say, which I would agree with. Like, yeah, you can't get stuck in rationality, but does that mean but this question of feeling, it's like I've seen it happen a lot of times where people, they learn the grammar of like embodiment, and they can use that to just become this kind of justification that's really hard to question, right? Because all of a sudden you've entered the world of vibes, and who's to say, like, who am I to question your feeling, bro, or gal? Like what? Maybe that is your deepest resonance, right? So there's this really tricky like space of what I think is, on the one hand, totally legitimate language, but on the other hand, this space of like sophism, you might say, rhetoric that can just be in service of pursuing what you want to pursue without being criticized for it, like in this kind of invulnerable way where you don't. And I see this dynamic a lot, and I think of it as kind of like the evolution of narcissism, where basically I think like narcissism is just like any other disease, like COVID, right? There's going to be variants. It's going to adapt. It's going to evolve. It's going to learn to like hide when it needs to hide, and it's going to learn to like disguise itself with the language that's going to like signal to others that there's no way I could be a narcissist because I'm talking about X, Y, and Z. But anyways, you know, I notice these dynamics. I think I do, anyways. And to me, it's like one of the. I don't know if there's like a thing you can do about that except try to become just like really smart and perceptive about it. I don't think you can get rid of it per se. It's like there's always going to be someone trying to find a way to work within, you know, what is normalized to get what they want, no matter if that, you know, costs other people. So yeah, it's tricky. It gives me some sympathy with people like Lao Tzu, with the sage who's just like, I'm just gonna go out in the woods, you guys. Like, I don't know, peace. I think about that sometimes. But even within ourselves, though, it's interesting, an interesting question, right? Like, what's an instinct? What's an intuition? What's an intellectual thought? What's reasoning? What's, you know, like bullshitting yourself? And I think this is all tricky stuff that I think about all the time. I think because I saw it so much when I was younger, I can see it in myself more quickly and readily. But you never know. That's the thing. You have to like always keep this level of humility, which is why I want to talk to Spacia about that thing. You can't be a humble island, right? You have to be part of a archipelago. I never knew how to pronounce that word. Archipelago. Anyway, archipelago. Yeah, you have to have people who can check your shit. But then that's another thing I see is that people that it just gets compromised as well, because I've seen people who like, no, I have people who check my shit, but it's people who are clearly in an echo chamber with each other, right? And they're creating the illusion of like accountability. So I don't know. I think I try not to think about that problem too much because I don't know what you can do about it. And yet it is a real problem. It is a real problem. And so that's something I keep coming back to whenever I think about like solutions at the social level, trying to see new forms of community arise that have, you know, anything that you might vouch for as like a good type of community fabric, but then avoid that potential for it to get compromised by a clever person who you know is a social chess player, I sometimes call them. And yeah, I don't know if there's a kind of like immune response that can kind of keep that from taking over. I don't know. Maybe everyone just has to like do psychedelics a lot, but then people use psychedelics to brainwash each other. So that's probably not the solution. A Jehovah's Witness tried to convert me with mushrooms once. Pretty cool. Yeah, he was like a Jehovah's Witness hitman, and it was wild, especially because they're not supposed to do those things. Anyway, I feel like I've been going on for a while, and thanks for letting me let it all hang out and get a little wild and weird and open today.
I am all about it. Thank you, Chris, and I will throw it on and then we'll bring it to a close. But I've really enjoyed. Well, I am, as you're speaking, like you're right. Like the group, you need to check you, but they can just participate in the self-deception, right? And yeah, I mean the group thing. There's something also about, to the degree an organization is just aware of the problem of self-deception. More and more, my mind is just going to the acceptance of this role of roles, right? Like also too, there's something about if you actually enact rationality that is just kind of doing this endless thing where it's always just kind of a cunning to justify what it wants to be. You can't play that role without it becoming real to you and you kind of hollowing yourself out actually and having an Ouroboros effect on your own character. I'm thinking about that. I'm also thinking about as well this idea on, like you're saying, it's very difficult to figure out the intuition, the relation to discernment, and all these different things. And I'll throw it to Seth and then Jock in here. And the likelihood of you doing that is really low in a role. Like it's that, like, let me put it this way. One of the reasons perhaps like roles do impact you is because when you take on a role, then it's already difficult to figure out how to make all of these things relate. And then you've got to remember that maybe the particular way you're making them relate in this circumstance is relative to your social role that you're having. And it's easy to forget that. And then they just come to serve the end. Will you become the role? So I'm now thinking about the problem of all these different kind of epistemological tools and how it becomes even more difficult to navigate them in a role, perhaps. But I'll pause and throw it to Seth here. Seth, please.
Well, as you were saying, you never know what you're going to catch. I said that. So I came in to talk about the monks, because that was my experience. And then I've been sitting here like, how can I get back to that? I'm not sure. But in the last little bit, something that occurs to me, like what this conversation has been about, another way would be what it occurs to me is what Vervaeke calls participatory knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's the cult leader, saying do this or eat these mushrooms and then read this book, or however they did that with you, Christian, I don't know. But so let's just say it can be done for virtue or for vice, but it's the actual doing of something that really changes me, right? I mean, I can read, whatever book, but then if I finish the book and walk out the front door and do something different, it's that thing I do after I read the book. I mean, the book might have, compelled me to do something or impelled me to do something, but when I go out and I do something different, I experience myself differently. And then I am different. And it could be that, I've got some sexual hang up and I say, well, let me just do the thing. And then wait, I'm the person who can do that thing that I didn't know that I could do. But likewise, well, anyway, the other thing that I was interested in, like when you were talking before about, this group that Michael referred to versus the hip hop artists jumping on stage versus the monks versus the politicians, is that everything we do, there's an audience, or there's not an audience, but the non-audience becomes a factor. I do something, that no one knows about, and I can be a certain kind of role. But if I'm in this community where we do certain things a certain way and I want to belong, then that's the container for my action. We haven't really been, like, the Epstein files have come up just a couple times, but like I was just looking at the news of Pam Bondi being in front of a congressional hearing the other day, and one of the senators says to her, so, how many people have you indicted that are in the Epstein files? And she won't answer the question. He keeps saying, and then she says, you're a loser. You're just a loser, and it's like, whatever she's doing there, I read that and I was like, she is fully committed to, like she can sit there and sort of say something that feels like impossible. Like, how do you get out of this question? Which is just like, and the politician said, I'll answer the question. You haven't indicted any of them, but she's fully committed to her role. So yeah, there's a few different things. This is probably going to feel like a total non sequitur, but I've been sitting here with this. I kind of wanted to share another little piece of what one of the monks, the main guy, who had the idea for the walk, what he said at the Lincoln Memorial. And again, just to say, well, to try to tie this on what I was just saying, yes, it became a social media sensation. It became a thing where people lined the streets. But in the beginning, I mean, I don't know all the story, but all the monks sort of talk about how we didn't expect the response. So by the time they're at the Lincoln Memorial, they're giving speeches. But in the beginning, they're just walking, and then people are attracted to the walking. So it wasn't done. I mean, I don't know. I mean, a group walks across the country and they have a reason for doing it. They call it the Walk for Peace. So it does seem like an invitation for people to notice, but it's like they're already walking, before the response begins. And then the platform that they end up on in Washington, D.C. is created because people show up, people are attracted, people are coming saying, what do you have to say? We are here to listen. We want to know. And anyway, so if it's all right, I want to read a little bit of this, but he's at the end of his talk, he said, I have 10 vows that I would love to share. And, as I read this, it kind of sounds like the loving kindness meditation. But I think it's brilliant also in that it's political, but it's not, he's talking about how we live, but he's also talking about a different kind of world we could live in. So he says, may every nation live in safety, stability, and dignity, free from fear, chaos, and unnecessary suffering. May every person be heard, respected, and protected regardless of their race, their background, their faith, and the language that they speak. May fear be replaced with understanding, and may misunderstanding never again become a reason for violence. May hatred be transformed into compassion. May peace exist not only in words and speeches, but in laws, policies, communities, and daily life. May true strength be measured not by control, force, or weapons, but by how we protect one another, especially our children and the vulnerable. May progress always walk together with morality, and may growth never be built on human suffering. May dialogue be chosen over confrontation and listening over judgment in families, societies, and nations. May people find peace within their own hearts so that the world no longer needs violence to survive. May the path to peace require no enemies, only human beings returning to morality, to responsibility, and to one another. Last but not least, and this was their most very deliberate message. They would say, please remember to write down this statement. He says, today is going to be my peaceful day. And this is like their slogan. And what they tell people in every city is, get out a piece of paper and a pen, and every day in the morning write down, today is going to be my peaceful day. And then as you go through the day, keep remembering that you said that. And it's like, but all of those statements I just read, they all kind of coalesce in that statement. Anyway, I just thought it was like, again, I think it is a political thing, but it's like their platform is, hey, we walked across the country and you all showed up, so here's what we have to say. And I just think that, as opposed to I mean, again, maybe it's another episode, but like I hear some people talking about the Epstein files. I haven't looked at it, but like my daughter's been reading it. Like people are talking about it, and they're reading the specific things that these people did, and it is just glaring that there's like, okay, now everyone knows what happened, but there's zero consequence, at least so far, at least in the United States. It seems like a number of people in Europe are, but it's just like, this thing about participation. So you have the Pam Bondi version, which is just like, I'm going to assert that I'm correct, and I'm just going to keep doing that. And actually, that seems to have a certain, they seem to be getting some traction with that. But then there's this other thing that's just like, these are the virtues I live by, and this is how I live, and I can do it in public because they're, these are my virtues, and the way I act every day demonstrates them. So I just think it's quite the moment, just to like the gestalt of all of this, together. So yeah, you never know what you're going to catch.
No, you don't. No, I appreciate you sharing that. And I'll throw it to Jock in here, and then I'll close us out this evening because of obligations. But I think I am very interested, like when you were speaking right there, again, I keep going back to this phrase, the role of roles. So in front of Congress, you're using your role one way, but there's a way in which if you say today is going to be my peaceful day, you're kind of pretending, right? Or you're kind of making a role for yourself, right? But isn't it interesting how is it pretending? Because if you do it and it is, then it's not pretending, but you're like selecting a role for yourself, right? Like, is much of our problem today not thinking about the role of roles and being intentional about roles and selecting roles? And I suppose we're very intentional about occupation and career, but not really role. And perhaps there's an issue where we're waiting to find our people before we determine our role. But maybe if we decide on our roles, then our people will be attracted. Like then the people will show up, right? And that actually perhaps the role of roles is primary, and then the social comes around it. Whereas if you're not thinking in those terms, then you actually let the social structure determine your role, and then you get pathologies, rather it be in front of Congress, rather it be in a cult, as Michael was describing. Not being intentional about the role of roles, but that actually makes me think about virtue and Jockin's work on that, and how there's a way in which in virtue, as distinct from mere ethics or law, that you're saying, I'm going to play a certain role. And that if I play that role, that actually opens up social horizons that could not be afforded otherwise. So I'll have to think on that, but let me pause and throw it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, thank you for being here today, sir.
Actually, Daniel, I mean, you brought up exactly where I was going to start, which is I'm going to try to throw out what I heard because I had to hop off the call for a second. But the whole point of a cult is to say, no, the knowledge must be embedded to me and my image, that I am the guru and you're nothing without me. And this is just a replication of how great I am by my knowledge, right? It's always it's a kind of Gnostic stance. So there's knowledge that only certain people have secrets to, that you get access to. And it's actually the most dangerous aspect. It uses the body. It's a Gnosticism of touch. And it's actually the most dangerous kind because of the quality of touch. Being the most concrete and particular. But actually what Espacito said too, most people's, and actually, again, Dimitri didn't go too much in detail about it. I didn't read his book about his chapter about it, but a lot of people, their sex is not about sex. It's about other things. It's actually not about the actual sensations. It's about it's these like fantasies or images or phantasms. And the basic point is the virtue aspect is being a kind of person. It's not like pleasure isn't good, virtue is good, but it's all about the orientation and reference point about it. And generally, one is absolutely not about performance, and it's about honest signals. I hear the story about the monks, it's an honest signal. Their authority came not from their privilege of knowledge or whatever, it came from, we're going to do this walk, and we're going to pay the price for that. And we get the privilege, we have the authority to speak, and people want to listen because of costly signals. That's what virtue is. There has to be a willingness to pay a price so that you have an authority, not really of you, but you're participating in, that gives you a space to speak, and the people will listen because of that. Very different from this kind of guru Gnostic stance of a master already knowing and not having it's not being demonstrated. And basically, I think what Christian's saying about, basically echo chambers, they're their own kind of, I made a comment about the net being the danger of the question. I think ultimately, I joke about the net being a cult. I always joke around about it because it does seem like I have all the qualities about it, but why not? But why is it not a cult? It's not a cult because, well, one, I don't think allowance of difference of opinions is allowed to happen here. But I think more importantly, I think it's very important. The issue is that we're interested in not just getting, quite frankly, headmaster Daniel's approval per se, but cultivating our own thought together. There's many insights I've gained from being in a room with all you great people and thinking through my own thought. It's that idea of generational development as opposed to just capture within a self-contained unit of replication. I think that's an very important aspect of just that cult thread. I think the idea of embodying a kind of way of being, which I think, again, Christian's point, the problem is how do you have discourse about it, right? Because if it's just internal states of mystic, esoteric, interior experience, how do you have discourse about it? This is true. But I think this is the whole point about enactments and actual enactments is things we can't discourse about. I think that's actually an important nuance about that, because the question of virtue is not what I know, but how do I carry myself in life? Ultimately, that's what health is. Health is not the image of appearance of healthiness. It's actually being a kind of person to have activities because you're fitting to a certain circumstance. I think I think is an important nuanced point. And that's the thing. And it's so critical because like people really have authentic needs that feel belonging, that have feelings of cultivation, and quite frankly, having the right orientations of their desire. I think these are perfectly legitimate points. But that's the danger is those things get hijacked and quite frankly co-opted for other purposes, nefarious, basically almost parasitic purposes. And that's always the point, is that these kind of spiritual rapes or captures or spins are actually far more evil because of that. And I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, what we're seeing, I think partly why people are so interested in it, it validates our suspicion that these are leaders in academics, in politics, economics, were not virtuous. We all kind of had an intuition about it, and now we see it presented in front of us, it very much documented. I think it's very much an incrimination about what happens when you have a social political order not based on virtue. This is the kind of implications you get out of it. I'll stop there.
No, very well put, and I'll give it to Mr. Ebert here. And I think, it's very interesting too when you're talking about like in a cult structure, someone has authority that gets approval versus creating a setting of co-mutual idea generation or development of which cannot be known ahead of time. Because, for example, with the net, we never know what we're going to talk about. So, for example, we talk about sex cults. And so no one can be quote unquote authority. And there's a surprise generation that can kind of emerge out of it and that can occur. And then, like you say, you have different discourses that are slamming against one another that opens different possibilities. And perhaps part of the issue is that when you have a social setting where people, quote unquote, know what people need, or they have the magic procedure or the certain something that is going to transform people in a certain way, then that becomes very problematic. As opposed to kind of hosting an ecosystem where a certain generation can occur where there's a surprise. But then, of course, there's a problem here because how would you convince people to join something that you don't know what's going to happen inside of it? Why would they do that? Unless they just get the quality or their friends or they're idiocentric and they believe in this kind of thing, right? So what ends up happening is you have to kind of have something that you can guarantee people for people to do it and to make it economically sustainable, blah, blah, blah. But then right there, you're setting up a risk of internal pathological developments that are very problematic. And perhaps at that point, then just being aware of the role of roles becomes very, very important. And I'm also thinking about a difference between using a body socially and being the body socially. That seems to perhaps be part of it. And actually, I think what you were saying about fantasies is actually a really, really big deal. There's a sense in which a lot of sex does not entail quote unquote touch. It's actually just fantasy. More would have to be said. I will have to think on that, but let me throw it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, please.
All right, I'll be very quick because I know that you have to go, and
You're
maybe
fine,
it's
sir.
provocation for next time. But regarding, I'll just riff on what Jockin just mentioned because I'm curious the extent to. I must be a cynic because I'm actually laughing at the extent, at the apparent earnestness with which Jockin just said it shows that our society is not built on virtue, and the suspicion is true that our society is not built on virtue, but it is. I mean, my provocation is that everything is a role, including virtue, and so I've played around with being monkish. My wife actually was a monk. She stayed at the same one that Leonard Cohen stayed at, and I've gone there and I've done tea ceremonies, and I've also been inducted into whatever Kriya yoga and these various things. The one thing that always stands out to me is the pretense. There is a certain pretense on top of which the scaffolding of the hierarchy of monkdom, or the very play, the concept of inducing yourself into monkdom is predicated on, and anyway, so back to this idea of virtue. I would actually say that what the Epstein files sort of reveal is that when you have a society built on virtue, that virtue is the exceeding of that virtue is impeded only by degrees of power. Everyone else is forced into a kind of virtue system, but those people who have excess power are not. That's all. That's what that shows us. Someone quipped, if you're not in the Epstein files, you're no one. And there's some horrific truth to that. That when your power exceeds the constraints of the scaffolding of a system, you no longer need to abide by that. And we see that with gurus, obviously. They don't abide by the constraints of their own cult. But we see that everywhere. I think we see that. I think it's fairly ubiquitous that we see. It's also baked into the Tantra Sutra divide that those who are tantric can do that which those who are sutric cannot. That there is sort of like a level to which you can ascend beyond which the rules simply don't apply. And there's something about virtue which is very sutric, and anyway, it's a horrific revelation. I think especially for women, um, you know, but it again brings back my question of this acting. Is it a revelation? Did we not already know that sex was the subtext of every interaction? How far did we decide to suppress that something like this becomes revelatory? I'm very much into the idea that 18 is a child and that the frontal lobe doesn't develop fully until you're 25 and so on and so forth. So I very much agree with all that. But to what extent are these delineations arbitrary for statutory rape, et cetera, et cetera? To what extent do we follow biological, development as to the readiness of a child to have sex? These are all fucked up questions that no one's ready to have an honest conversation about, because the entire conversation would expose the entire scaffolding of culture and cultural norms. So it's really problematic, and the only choice is simply to not talk about it, suppress it, and thereby the scaffolding gets to persist. And actually, Daniel, when you were saying earlier, yes, I mean, here we're interested in truth and so on, and of course that's what I'm interested in, but I don't know that culture or relationships are even possible without a lie. I don't know that you can play a role without lying. And the other thing that was coming to me is just, and I don't know if this is here or there, but I love Love on the Spectrum. It's one of my favorite shows. And one thing you notice, they're not playing a role, right? They can't. That's actually their handicap, is that they don't know how to play a role. Then they have someone come in and teach them how to pretend to be human. They'd be like, and then ask them, oh, and then say that you're in. And they give them all these like really like canned responses to things to pretend to be to play a role, to pretend to be interested, to pretend to get the person, and all these things. And so then you watch them go through these super mechanized variations on what it is to be to play a role. And we do these things second nature. We just start playing our role instantly. Oh, and then people call it love bombing, but really what it is like it's that NRE, to bring back a phrase that that I guess Clayton was into. But it's just that, oh, I want to show attention, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is the play. Anyway, so without the lying, I just don't, so the role of dishonesty seems to be so central to making things work, to relation, that, and I I don't know that I've ever really read anything. Maybe one of you guys, maybe this has been a very, very well explored. Certainly Freud was all about this, that the sexual suppression, but I think more fundamentally just lying seems to be central to even the premise of honesty. So it's more fundamental than than honesty in the sense that lying gives us some kind of predicate for relation. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, you bring up so many good things. Okay. Yes to, okay. So, we'll take the children to the creek, I promise. But there's a lot here. It's very, very important. So what's very interesting is, first off, there seems to be a role of roles, because if you don't have roles, you overwhelm people. There is some sort of shielding, some sort of, you could even say, deceit that seems to be in the structure necessary, right? Like there's also something about overwhelming people with things that can be very problematic. There's also the fact that sometimes people get upset if you don't deceive them because they didn't want to know all that. And now you're telling them a lot. So actually they get pissed off if you don't deceive them, right? So there's something here, I guess for me, a lot of times in my work, there's a lot that's very important. I'm always playing with the language of unveiling, with the UN in parentheses, and the love craft, where it's love, but the craft is in parentheses. And there is some sort of artfulness of being able to determine how to unveil and how to veil in a manner that does not make lovecraft, right? And that society absolutely is structured around determining the mean and the way to go about this. And you mentioned Freud, obviously my beloved Philip Reef. He's like, yeah, society is all about givens and releases, and if you do it wrong, everything goes to heck real fast. And there is questions on to what degree are these revelations, to what degree are they simply things that people need to act like are revelations. I mean, I think people would probably point out that, yes, we know sex is always doing this, but then the degree of the children, the rings of those kind of things, I think that opens up doors. I think also there's just a question that people have of what role did this have? Like, what role politically, socially, geopolitically, what did it influence? What wars happened because of this? What economic transitions, actions occurred because of this? I think for me, I will speak personally, perhaps if the Epstein had it seemingly has had an impact on what trade agreements are signed, what wars countries get into, what governments are able to get a seat at the table and not. And so the sex is tied in with that geopolitical. And that's where I think for me, it is, I don't know what to think of that. That's crazy, but I don't disagree on what you're pointing out. I do think there are conversations about sex we're not ready to have. I don't think you're wrong about that. I think it's very, very difficult. The thing I also think that you're pointing out on virtue, obviously we've talked about like virtue and beauty. And I think when Jock and I would speak, we would talk about the beautiful. And of course, that's all of that. But I think you're definitely saying with Epstein that virtue based on the quote unquote good, if you will, like on that conversation we had, and all this would have to be expanded upon, absolutely is used to capture people, absolutely is used basically for lower classes and the average person. Well, people with power don't have to worry about it. To me, that all actually speaks on where virtue based on the good is not sufficient. It just feeds power dynamics. It feeds control. It just feeds into holding people down while other people don't have to think about it. But then it would get into the question of the virtue of the beautiful and why do that and what is that distinction and all of those different things. But you're definitely, I think there is, I think that's, the point you're making there, and then this is very important. I appreciate you bringing this all up. I think all of that is though pointing to why this seems to potentially have, and it obviously will just be forgotten. It could easily be forgotten next week with some new Greenland being taken over or something. I don't know, but there's really this idea of I think there's a sense of people almost intuiting, even if they can't articulate it. Wait, is ethics just made for me and not for them? Is this actually what keeps me down? Would I be like a millionaire if I would not be so constrained? Could I just be like really rich like some of these people are? Like, wait a minute, hold on. And that makes people not happy. And that is, I think, something people are talking about. But I definitely think the Epstein suggests we need to rethink what we're talking about when we talk about virtue. And that actually there is a new approach to that is necessary. But I appreciate all of that. I hate to run, but I will run here. Alex, thank you, sir. Michael, thank you. Jockin, thank you. Seth, thank you. Have a good one. All the best.